Debugging is a fundamental part of software development, yet it's rarely taught in any formal computer science program. Like anything else in life, though, you get better at debugging with practice. There are some best practices that you can follow to make your code more easily debuggable, which will save you time and frustration in the long run. And there are some techniques that you can use when you're trying to track down bugs that will help you find the source of the problem faster. Let's take a look at some of those now. Okay, so before we get into how to debug, it's helpful to know how to write code that's easy to debug. First of all, that means writing code that's easy to read. That may seem obvious, but sometimes you'll see code that looks like this. Now, if you've written code like this before, please don't beat yourself up. It happens to the best of us. But generally, you want to avoid doing things like this because it makes your code hard to read. Instead, pick descriptive variable names. For example, here, order total is much easier to understand than just X. Also, try to keep your functions and methods small and focused on a single task. This will not only make your code easier to read, but it also makes it easier to test, which is another great practice. Now, you might be thinking, what does testing have to do with debugging? Well, let me tell you, when you're testing your code, you should always have the same goal in mind as when you're debugging, which is to answer the question, why is this code not working the way that I expect it to? So if you're writing your tests and you start to encounter issues, then you should treat those errors as a learning opportunity. Think about what you could do differently next time to avoid getting stuck in that situation again. And that also applies to debugging. Let's take a look at an example. So let's say you have a function called calculate taxes, and it takes a purchase price and a tax rate, and returns the amount of taxes due on that purchase. You write tests for this function, and then you run the tests, and you see that they're failing. So you go ahead and fix the function, and the tests start passing. But now you want to think about what could go wrong in this function. What are the edge cases? So you add some tests for edge cases and you run the tests, and again you see that they're failing. Again you go ahead and fix the function and the tests start passing. But then you want to think about what could still go wrong. Maybe there's some errors that you didn't catch in your tests. So you go ahead and you manually test the function by putting in different values. And you notice that for some reason, when you put in a negative number for the purchase price, then the function is returning a weird result. In this case, the function was returning the absolute value of the purchase price multiplied by the tax rate. So obviously that's not correct. You would never want to return the absolute value of a quantity of money. So you go ahead and fix that, and now the function works correctly. So in this example, we found a bug by manually testing the function, but we could have found that same bug by looking at our tests and asking ourselves, what edge cases are we not testing here? Are we testing negative numbers? Are we testing decimals? Are we testing really large numbers? So whenever you're debugging or writing tests, you want to put yourself in the shoes of the person who's going to maintain the code after you. And that includes the person who's going to maintain it in the future, which is going to be you. Another thing that you can do to make your code more easily debuggable is to use a version control system like Git. That way you can always refer back to the last time that the code worked correctly if you ever run into issues. Okay, so now let's talk about some actual techniques that you can use when you're debugging. The first one is logging. So let's say you run your code and nothing happens. You don't see any errors. But when you check the database, you notice that no records were added. Well, that doesn't help you very much, does it? Because you don't know why no records were added. One thing that you can do to help you figure out what's going on is to add some logs to your code, and ideally you want to do this in production. Also, you want to be able to turn logging on and off, preferably from an environment variable. So let's say you have this order service right here. Well, you can add a log line inside of the createOrder method. Then you can create a logging module that has a method called info that prints a message to the console if the logging level is set to info or higher. And you can also create a logging level that's set to debug, and it prints a message to the console if the logging level is set to debug or higher. And you can also create an environment variable called log level and use it to determine what the logging level is. Now, when you run the application with log level debug, then you'll see output from both the info log and the debug log. But if you run the application with log level info or with log level error, then you'll see only the messages corresponding to those logging levels. And this gives you flexibility over what messages you want to see. And one final thing here is that we're using the struct log library, which is a Python library for structured logging, and it allows you to include additional data with your log messages. So we're including the order ID with the log messages here, and that makes it easier to see what's going on in your logs. If you want to learn more about effective logging, I'll leave a link to a great article in the description. Okay, another useful technique is to use a debugger. Debuggers allow you to set breakpoints in your code and inspect variables while the code is running. So let's say you're in a situation where you suspect that a certain variable has an incorrect value. You can set a breakpoint at the line where that variable is assigned, and then you can step through the code line by line to see how the variable is changing. Okay, another useful technique is to use error handling. So let's say you have a function called getUser that takes a user ID and returns a user object. Well, if something goes wrong, maybe the user ID is invalid or the user doesn't exist, then it's going to raise an exception. But instead of letting the exception propagate all the way up the call stack, it's a good idea to handle the exception locally and log the error and then return a default value. Now you could use a try except block to handle the exception, but another option is to use the try context manager. The nice thing about the try context manager is that it automatically closes the connection to the database even if an error occurs. All right, another useful technique is to profile your code. Profiling your code helps you identify performance bottlenecks so you can focus your debugging efforts on the most important parts of your code. There are a few different ways to profile your code. One way is to use the built-in profiling tools that come with your programming language. For example, Python has a built-in profiler. Another way is to use a profiling library. For example, in Python, you could use the cprofile library. And finally, you can also use a profiling tool. For example, you could use something like the Python profiler. And another thing that you can do is to use assertions. Assertions are a way to test for conditions that you expect to be true. If the condition is not true, then an assertion error is raised. So let's say we have this calculate taxes function that we talked about earlier. We could add an assertion to check that the purchase price is non-negative. Finally, another thing that you can do is to use static analysis tools. Static analysis tools analyze your code without actually running it. They can help you identify potential problems before they become actual errors. For example, in Python, you can use a static analysis tool called pylint. Okay, so those are some best practices for debugging back-end code. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and let me know in the comments if you have any other tips for debugging. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.